Paris woke beneath a humid summer sky on August 10, 1792, with bells and drums carrying through the narrow streets toward the Tuileries palace, where frightened courtiers and guards waited for reliable orders while the royal family prepared to leave the residence and seek protection beside the Legislative Assembly. Inside this crisis stood Louis XVI, 37 years old, the last king of the Ancien Régime Bourbon monarchy, surrounded by the institutions, ceremonies, uniforms, and symbols of a kingship that had presented itself for generations as ancient, hereditary, and sanctioned by God, yet was now discovering that inherited legitimacy could no longer guarantee obedience in its own capital. Armed insurgents, sections of the National Guard, and revolutionary authorities were converging upon the Tuileries as the political confrontation between king and revolution approached its decisive rupture. Before the day was over, Louis and his family would take refuge with the Legislative Assembly, and the king's authority would soon be suspended. Wikipedia +1 The striking question is not simply how a monarchy could fall, but how this monarchy had become powerful enough to make its fall so consequential. How had the House of Bourbon risen from the devastation of the French Wars of Religion, constructed one of Europe's most formidable monarchies, turned Versailles into the supreme theater of royal authority, fought wars across Europe and overseas, and still reached a moment when the crown could no longer reliably secure political obedience, consent for taxation, or acceptance of reform? To answer that question, the story cannot begin in 1792. It must return more than 2 centuries, to a France fractured by religious conflict and a disputed succession, when Henry of Navarre inherited the French crown as Henry IV in 1589 and established the Bourbon dynasty on the throne. His accession did not instantly settle the kingdom. The new king had to confront the realities of religious division, political resistance, foreign intervention, and contested legitimacy before his conversion to Catholicism and the settlement embodied in the Edict of Nantes of 1598 helped create a framework for ending the religious wars and granting defined protections to the Huguenot minority within a Catholic monarchy. Wikipedia +1 From Henry IV and the reconstruction associated with his reign and the work of Sully, the story will pass to Louis XIII, the regency of Marie de' Medici, and Cardinal Richelieu, when noble resistance, Huguenot political and military power, the siege of La Rochelle, expanding royal administration, and France's struggle against Habsburg power revealed both the ambitions and the limits of centralization. It will then move through the Fronde, the upheavals that marked the minority of Louis XIV and demonstrated how difficult it remained for the monarchy to control courts, elites, cities, officeholders, and competing political interests. From those crises emerged Louis XIV's personal rule after 1661, a reign that would define the image of Bourbon kingship for generations. Versailles became central to that image. Its galleries, apartments, ceremonies, offices, audiences, patronage networks, and carefully ordered court life transformed the palace into an extraordinary political stage on which access to the monarch itself could carry meaning. Yet Versailles must not become an easy explanation for everything that followed. It was a real palace and governmental center, and it became an enduring symbol of royal magnificence and distance from many subjects, but it was not a single machine that bankrupted France. Nor did Louis XIV exercise power in a vacuum. Royal councils, ministers, provincial authorities, courts, parliaments, municipalities, churches, officeholders, customary law, privilege, and negotiated relationships continued to constrain how policy actually moved from royal command into practice. The same distinction is essential to the word tyranny in this story. It is dramatic historical shorthand, not a claim that Bourbon France was governed only by the arbitrary wishes of an unrestricted king. There were genuine coercive dimensions to Bourbon rule: censorship, unequal privilege, burdensome taxation, religious repression, and increasingly expansive claims for royal authority. The revocation of the Edict of Nantes under Louis XIV in 1685 provides one of the clearest examples of the coercive religious policies that accompanied the monarchy's drive for confessional unity. But absolutist theory and administrative reality were never identical, and understanding that difference is crucial to understanding both Bourbon strength and Bourbon vulnerability. From Louis XIV, Colbert, religious repression, and the Great Dynastic Wars, including the War of the Spanish Succession, the investigation will move into the 18th century, where inherited debts, fiscal experiments, or expenditure, privilege and repeated political conflict exposed problems no ruler could solve merely by issuing commands. Under Louis XV, disputes with the parliaments, overseas setbacks during the 7 Years' War, and the Mopia confrontation became part of a longer erosion of confidence in royal government. Under Louis XVI, the problem became acute. Ministers including Turgot, Necker, and Calonne attempted reforms, while France's intervention in the American War of Independence added further pressure to an already unequal fiscal structure. The Assembly of Notables, the failure to secure durable reform, and the calling of the Estates General transformed a financial emergency into a struggle over representation and sovereignty. Then came 1789, the Estates General, the National Assembly, the Tennis Court Oath, the Bastille, the August Decrees, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, and the October days that brought the royal family from Versailles to Paris. Constitutional monarchy did not settle the struggle. The civil constitution of the clergy opened new divisions, the flight to Varennes in June 1791 deepened distrust, and war with Austria and Prussia intensified political radicalization. By August 10, 1792, all of those unresolved pressures had converged upon the Tuileries. This is where the phrase, bloody fall, must also be tested rather than simply repeated. The Bourbon monarchy did not collapse because of violence alone. Fiscal breakdown, institutional conflict, political mobilization, war, contested sovereignty, royal decisions, revolutionary decisions, propaganda, fear, and accumulated distrust interacted over years. The monarchy would be abolished by the National Convention on September 21, 1792, and Louis XVI would be executed on January 21, 1793. Wikipedia Marie Antoinette would meet her own fate later that year, but even those events did not permanently end monarchy in France. The Bourbons returned under Louis XVIII in 1814 and again in 1815, and the senior Bourbon line remained on the throne through the reign of Charles X until the Revolution of 1830. Wikipedia +1 So the morning at the Tuileries is not merely the opening scene of a royal collapse. It is the end point of a question that began when Henry IV claimed a divided kingdom in 1589. How could a dynasty build authority powerful enough to dominate the political imagination of Europe, yet leave behind a system unable to adapt when the terms of political legitimacy themselves began to change? To understand why Louis XVI could no longer command unquestioned obedience in Paris, we must go back to the moment when the Bourbons first had to persuade France to accept their crown. The Bourbon claim to France in 1589 was legally powerful, politically explosive, and far from secure. When Henry III was assassinated on August 2, 1589, the Valois line had reached its end, and the nearest legitimate male heir under the traditional rules of succession was Henry of Navarre, head of the Bourbon branch of the Capetian dynasty. Yet inheritance alone could not make France obey him. Henry had been raised in the Protestant tradition and had become one of the most prominent Huguenot leaders in a kingdom where the overwhelming majority of subjects remained Catholic and where the Catholic League refused to accept a Protestant sovereign. His accession as Henry IV therefore began not with undisputed possession of the realm but with a struggle over legitimacy, religion, military power, and the meaning of kingship itself. The surviving evidence shows that Henry could claim the crown by dynastic right, but enforcing that claim required negotiation as much as warfare. Catholic League forces continued to resist him, Spain supported opponents of the Bourbon succession, and important cities, including Paris, remained outside his effective control. Henry won significant victories at Arques in 1589 and Ivry in 1590, but military success did not erase the confessional obstacle separating the king from many of the people whose obedience he required. In 1593, Henry converted to Catholicism. Later legend reduced this decision to a famous witty phrase about Paris being worth a mass, but there is no secure contemporary basis for treating that saying as a reliable record of his exact words or private reasoning. What the political evidence does establish is that conversion removed one of the greatest barriers to broader recognition of his kingship. Henry was crowned at Chartres on February 27, 1594, because Reims, the traditional coronation city, was not yet securely available to him, and he entered Paris the following month. The symbolism was immense, but the work of consolidation was only beginning. Years of religious and civil war had damaged royal finances, disrupted commerce, burdened communities, empowered armed factions, and weakened the crown's ability to impose policy uniformly across a kingdom governed through layers of provincial privileges, courts, offices, local institutions, and negotiated obligations. Henry IV did not inherit a modern centralized state waiting to be repaired. He inherited a composite monarchy whose authority depended upon constant bargaining between royal objectives and entrenched interests. The Edict of Nantes, issued in 1598, became one of the most important instruments of that settlement. It did not establish religious liberty in the modern sense, nor did it place Catholicism and Protestantism on equal footing. Catholic worship remained privileged, while French Protestants received defined and conditional rights to worship in specified places, legal protections, access to certain offices, and temporary guarantees connected to fortified places and security arrangements. The settlement reflected the realities of a kingdom exhausted by conflict rather than a philosophical declaration of universal toleration. In the same year, the Peace of Bourbons ended the war between France and Spain, giving Henry's government greater room to turn from. Dynastic survival toward reconstruction. Royal recovery during the following decade was closely associated with Maximilian de Bethune, later Duke of Sully, one of Henry's most important servants. Sully helped reorganize aspects of royal finance, sought tighter supervision of revenues and expenditures, and worked to strengthen the crown's fiscal position, but even these efforts depended upon inherited institutions, officeholders, provincial arrangements, tax systems, and compromises that could not simply be swept aside. Taxation remained uneven. Privilege remained embedded in the social and legal structure of the kingdom. Royal authority increasingly asserted itself, yet France was still administratively diverse and politically negotiated. Reconstruction also involved roads, bridges, waterways, agriculture, commerce, and efforts to restore the practical infrastructure that allowed royal government and economic life to function after decades of disruption. Henry managed nobles through patronage, appointments, pensions, reconciliation, and selective pressure rather than by eliminating aristocratic power. Dynastic consolidation mattered just as much. His earlier marriage to Margaret of Valois was annulled, and in 1600 he married Marie de' Medici, a match that strengthened dynastic security and connected the monarchy to the powerful Medici family. Their son, the future Louis XIII, was born in 1601, giving the new Bourbon line something it had lacked at the moment of Henry's accession, a direct male successor. Yet the apparent stabilization of the dynasty remained vulnerable to the dependence of monarchy upon individual rulers, court alliances, ministerial networks, and political confidence. On May 14, 1610, François Ravaillac assassinated Henry IV in Paris. The event abruptly transferred the crown to Louis XIII, who was only 8 years old, and opened a regency under Marie de' Medici. The transition exposed how quickly political competition could reappear when royal authority passed into a minority. Marie's government faced struggles over patronage, noble influence, foreign policy, and control of access to the young king. Powerful aristocrats sought advantage. Factions competed at court, and the monarchy again had to negotiate with elites whose cooperation could not be taken for granted. Louis XIII assumed personal authority in 1617, but the problem confronting the crown was larger than any single court faction. How could a monarchy strengthen its capacity to govern without provoking the very resistance that greater control might produce? That question became central after Cardinal Armand Jean du Plessis de Richelieu rose into the King's Council and became Louis XIII's chief minister in 1624. Richelieu is often portrayed as the architect who created French absolutism almost by himself, but that image compresses a far more complicated process. He operated through existing royal councils, magistrates, governors, military commanders, financial officials, provincial institutions, patronage networks, and the authority of the king. His policies sought to reduce forms of political and military autonomy that could challenge royal power, especially when they intersected with noble rebellion, fortified strongholds, or foreign alliances. One major test came from the Huguenots. The Edict of Nantes had protected specified religious rights, but Protestant communities also possessed political assemblies, fortified places, and military capacities that royal ministers increasingly regarded as incompatible with stronger monarchical control. The confrontation culminated at La Rochelle, the principal Huguenot stronghold on the Atlantic coast, which was besieged by royal forces from 1627 to 1628. Its submission was a decisive political victory for Louis XIII and Richelieu, but it did not immediately abolish Protestant worship. The Peace of Alès in 1629 dismantled Huguenot political and military privileges and required the removal of fortifications associated with organized resistance, while preserving important religious provisions established under the Edict of Nantes. The distinction matters. The crown was attacking autonomous political and military power before the later monarchy moved toward a much more comprehensive policy of religious repression. At the same time, Richelieu confronted aristocratic conspiracies and revolts while expanding mechanisms by which the monarchy could supervise the provinces. Royal commissioners and officials known as intendants became increasingly important in matters involving justice, policing, finance, and administration, particularly during periods of war. Yet they did not instantly replace provincial governors, parliaments, municipal authorities, estates, seigneurial jurisdictions, or existing officeholders. Centralization was a process of overlap, conflict, adaptation, and expansion rather than the sudden creation of a uniform bureaucracy. Its most demanding test came from foreign war. Richelieu's France was Catholic, but strategic rivalry with the Catholic Habsburg dynasties of Spain and the Holy Roman Empire increasingly outweighed simple confessional alignment. France supported opponents of Habsburg power indirectly before entering the 30 Years' War openly against Spain in 1635. Warfare increased the monarchy's military reach, but it also increased taxation, borrowing, administrative pressure, and demands upon provincial communities. The stronger the crown attempted to become abroad, the more resources it had to extract at home, and those demands created tensions that would not disappear when the armies stopped moving. Richelieu died in December 1642. Louis XIII followed him in May 1643, leaving the throne to his 4-year-old son, Louis XIV. The Bourbon dynasty had survived religious civil war, dynastic uncertainty, noble resistance, Huguenot political autonomy, and expanding conflict with the Habsburgs, but the state it passed to the child king was more powerful and more burdened at the same time. Royal administration had extended its reach, yet taxation and war had deepened resentment, institutions still defended their privileges, and another royal minority opened the center of government to renewed competition. Louis XIV would grow up under the shadow of that contradiction, and the crisis soon to erupt around his childhood would leave a political memory with consequences far beyond the boy king's earliest years. Whenever the center appeared weak, forces the monarchy believed it had contained could rise again. When Louis XIV inherited the French crown in May 1643, he was 4 years old, too young to govern and already surrounded by the unresolved pressures that had accumulated under his father. Anne of Austria became regent, and Cardinal Jules Mazarin emerged as the dominant ministerial figure in a monarchy still fighting the Habsburg powers abroad while struggling to finance war at home. The crown had expanded its administrative reach, but that expansion carried a price. Wartime taxation pressed heavily on communities already divided by privilege, regional exemptions, unequal assessment, and different systems of collection. Royal government depended upon financiers, officeholders, provincial elites, magistrates, tax farmers, and local authorities whose cooperation could not simply be commanded into existence. In 1648, that fragile balance broke into the series of conflicts remembered as the Fronde. What began with opposition from the Parliament of Paris and other institutional actors to fiscal and administrative measures widened into a shifting struggle involving princes, nobles, magistrates, cities, ministers, and armed factions. The Fronde lasted, in different forms, until 1653, and it exposed a central problem of Bourbon government. The crown could claim supreme sovereignty while still depending upon institutions and elites capable of resisting, delaying, bargaining, or exploiting moments of weakness. Later political memory would treat the disorder of these years as a warning about the dangers of divided authority, but it would be too simple to say that the Fronde alone created Louis XIV's later absolutism or that a single childhood experience determined his policies. The monarchy he inherited was already moving toward stronger central direction, and the solutions developed after the Fronde grew from decades of administrative practice, fiscal pressure, war, and institutional conflict. When Mazarin died in 1661, Louis XIV announced that he would govern personally. This did not mean that every decision thereafter originated from the king acting alone. Personal rule rested on an increasingly disciplined system of councils, ministers, secretaries, intendants, military administrators, diplomats, financiers, clerks, and information networks that brought reports from the provinces and translated royal priorities into policy. Jean-Baptiste Colbert became crucial in finance, commerce, manufacturing, naval affairs, and royal building projects. François-Michel Le Tellier and his son, François-Michel Le Tellier, Marquis de Louvois, played major roles in military administration and the organization of the army. Other officials managed diplomacy, justice, ecclesiastical affairs, taxation, and provincial government. Louis XIV stood at the center of this structure, but the machinery of monarchy functioned through thousands of intermediaries whose interests did not always align perfectly with those of the crown. The political language surrounding the king nevertheless emphasized a powerful ideal. Royal sovereignty was presented as indivisible and supreme, and court culture cultivated an image of the monarch as the source of order, justice, honor, and political authority. Contemporary state portraiture helped make that image visible. In portraits associated with Hyacinthe Rigaud and other court artists, Louis XIV appeared surrounded by regalia, rich textiles, ceremonial space, and carefully constructed symbols of rank. These images were not photographic records of everyday government. They were political representations designed to communicate majesty, continuity, and controlled authority. The same distinction applies to absolutism itself. The monarchy claimed broad sovereign powers, but those claims existed inside a kingdom structured by customary law, corporate privilege, venal office, provincial estates, parliaments, seigneurial jurisdictions, church institutions, municipal rights, tax exemptions, and uneven administrative capacity. The king could issue edicts and ordinances, but their enforcement depended on officials, courts, collectors, soldiers, clerics, governors, and local elites. Absolutism was therefore both a political doctrine and a practical program of stronger royal coordination, not evidence that France had become a perfectly centralized state governed without institutional limits. No place expressed the image of this monarchy more dramatically than Versailles. What had begun as a royal hunting residence under Louis XIII was transformed under Louis XIV through repeated campaigns of construction, landscaping, decoration, and ceremonial organization. Architects, gardeners, painters, sculptors, engineers, craftsmen, musicians, and administrators turned the site into a vast complex of apartments, galleries, gardens, offices, service spaces, chapels, stables, and court facilities. In 1682, the court and central royal household were established there on a permanent basis. Versailles became a political theater in which access itself had meaning. Who could approach the king, who could attend particular ceremonies, who received apartments, offices, honors, pensions, or invitations, and who waited outside important rooms all formed part of the language of hierarchy. Rituals surrounding waking, dining, worship, audiences, and public appearances turned ordinary actions into demonstrations of rank and proximity. Yet Versailles was not simply a luxury playground. It was a working court and governmental environment where ministers presented business, petitions were advanced, appointments were negotiated, foreign ambassadors observed royal ceremony, and aristocratic families pursued influence. Architecture and spectacle magnified power, but patronage also created obligations, rivalries, and dependence. The same mixture of ambition and limitation shaped Colbert's economic program. Colbert sought to strengthen royal revenues, encourage manufacturing, improve the quality and regulation of French goods, protect selected industries through tariffs, expand overseas trade, enlarge the navy, and support colonial administration. Royal manufacturers and commercial companies received privileges and subsidies, while customs policy was used to encourage domestic production and restrict certain imports. Naval expansion helped France compete more seriously for maritime power. Colonial administration extended royal ambitions into the Caribbean, North America, and other overseas spaces. But these policies produced uneven results, and they were not free of coercion. Regulation could burden producers, commercial monopolies favored selected interests, taxation remained unequal, and overseas expansion was tied to systems of forced labor and imperial competition that cannot be reduced to a story of national prosperity. Religious policy also became increasingly coercive. The limited protections that French Protestants had retained under the Edict of Nantes were gradually narrowed through administrative restrictions, pressure on Protestant institutions, limitations on worship, and campaigns encouraging or forcing conformity. In 1685, Louis XIV issued the Edict of Fontainebleau, revoking the Edict of Nantes and removing the legal framework that had protected Protestant worship in specified forms. Protestant churches were closed or destroyed under the new policy, clergy were pressured to leave or convert, and many lay Protestants faced powerful efforts to compel Catholic conformity. Significant numbers sought refuge outside France despite legal restrictions on departure. Historians have long debated the precise economic consequences of this migration, and the surviving evidence does not support reducing later French economic problems to a single demographic or commercial loss. What is clear is that the policy tied royal authority more closely to religious uniformity and demonstrated the coercive capacity of a monarchy increasingly unwilling to tolerate institutionalized confessional difference. At the same time, Louis XIV pursued wars that connected dynasty, security, prestige, and territorial ambition. The War of Devolution from 1667 to 1668 was justified through dynastic claims relating to the Spanish Netherlands, while the Dutch War from 1672 to 1678 expanded into a wider European confrontation. These conflicts brought military victories, territorial gains, diplomatic settlements, and international prestige, but they also required enormous mobilization. Armies had to be recruited, supplied, transported, housed, and paid. Fortifications had to be built and maintained. Taxes had to be collected more intensely, loans arranged, offices sold, revenues anticipated, and provincial cooperation continually negotiated. War strengthened the machinery of government while simultaneously increasing the crown's dependence upon the very fiscal and social structures that limited reform. By the later decades of Louis XIV's reign, Versailles stood at the height of its symbolic power. Foreign visitors saw a court whose architecture, ceremony, art, gardens, and disciplined hierarchy projected confidence on a scale few European monarchies could equal. The king's image appeared to fuse political authority with cultural magnificence, military prestige, religious unity, and dynastic permanence. Yet behind that carefully ordered spectacle stood a less stable reality. Royal power still rested upon credit, privilege, unequal taxation, office-holding, provincial negotiation, and the willingness of institutions and communities to provide resources. The monarchy could display extraordinary authority while remaining structurally dependent on cooperation it could never fully replace. The brighter Versailles became as a symbol of Bourbon power, the more tightly the crown's prestige became bound to expensive war, confessional uniformity, fiscal extraction, and a system whose magnificence could conceal pressures that future reigns would find increasingly difficult to manage. By the final decades of Louis XIV's reign, the monarchy had reached a level of international visibility and dynastic ambition that made retreat increasingly difficult. France had become one of Europe's dominant military powers, but the same system that projected strength abroad required continuous extraction at home, and each major war tested the limits of taxation, credit, administration, and political endurance. The conflict commonly known as the War of the League of Augsburg, fought from 1688 to 1697, grew from a wider European struggle over territorial claims, dynastic rights, imperial security, and fear of French expansion. It was not the product of one king's will alone. The Dutch Republic, England, the Holy Roman Empire, Spain, and other powers responded to a changing balance of power in which French strength had become a central concern. The resulting war placed enormous demands on the Bourbon state. Armies expanded, fortifications consumed resources, taxation intensified, and the crown relied increasingly on borrowing and financial expedients to sustain operations. The peace that followed did not resolve the deeper dynastic question that soon threatened Europe again. In 1700, Charles II of Spain died without children, leaving a succession crisis over one of the largest composite monarchies in Europe. His will named Philip of Anjou, a grandson of Louis XIV, as heir to the Spanish crown. Philip became Philip V of Spain, but the prospect of a Bourbon prince ruling Spain raised immediate fears that French and Spanish power might become too closely united. Competing dynastic claims, strategic concerns, commercial interests, and the European balance of power combined to produce the War of the Spanish Succession, which began in 1701 and continued until 1714. Louis XIV defended his grandson's inheritance, but the conflict cannot be explained as the personal project of a single monarch. Austria pressed Habsburg claims, England and the Dutch Republic sought to prevent excessive Bourbon concentration, and numerous states entered the struggle according to their own security, dynastic, and commercial calculations. For France, the war became one of the most severe tests of the reign. Wartime taxation increased pressure on subjects already divided by privilege and unequal fiscal obligations. The crown borrowed heavily, manipulated forms of credit, sold offices, anticipated future revenues, and resorted to monetary changes in an effort to keep the military machine functioning. These methods could raise money quickly, but they also exposed the dependence of royal power on confidence among financiers, tax collectors, officeholders, and creditors. At the same time, poor harvests and severe subsistence crises intensified hardship in parts of the kingdom. Contemporary records describe rising grain prices, distress, and disruption, but the surviving evidence varies greatly by region, and it would be misleading to invent a single experience for all French households. What can be said with confidence is that war, taxation, harvest failure, and market instability interacted in ways that made the later reign feel increasingly burdensome to many communities. The peace settlements beginning with the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 transformed the European order. Philip V remained King of Spain, preserving the Bourbon dynasty there, but formal arrangements required that the French and Spanish crowns remain separate. France surrendered or recognized important territorial and commercial concessions, while Britain emerged with strengthened strategic and imperial advantages. For Louis XIV, the settlement preserved a crucial dynastic success, but it also confirmed that Bourbon ambition had reached limits imposed by the collective resistance of other European powers. The final years of the reign were also marked by an unexpected crisis of succession. A series of deaths within the royal family removed several direct heirs in a remarkably short period, leaving the future of the French crown dependent on a young child. When Louis XIV died in September 1715 after more than 70 years on the throne, his successor was his great-grandson Louis XV, only 5 years old. The monarchy that passed to him remained formidable, but it carried a heavy financial inheritance and a political system shaped by decades of war, privilege, and administrative complexity. Because the new king was a minor, government passed into a regency under Philippe II, Duke of Orleans. The regent inherited a state burdened by substantial debt and a financial structure that had repeatedly relied on short-term expedients. In this context, the experiments associated with the Scottish financier John Law should be understood as an ambitious attempt to restructure credit and state finance, not simply as a tale of fraud or irrational speculation. Law promoted a banking system based on paper currency and helped develop the company that came to be associated with the Mississippi Enterprise and French colonial trade. The system sought to convert portions of state debt into company shares, expand liquidity, and create a more flexible financial framework. For a time, rising share prices and expanding credit produced extraordinary enthusiasm. Then confidence collapsed. By 1720, speculative prices had fallen dramatically, and the system disintegrated under the pressure of redemption demands, policy reversals, and the growing mismatch between paper claims and sustainable confidence. The episode damaged trust in financial innovation, but it did not erase France's fiscal problems. Those problems remained embedded in a tax system divided by privilege, regional variation, exemptions, indirect taxes, venal office, and dependence on complex networks of collection and credit. Louis XV eventually moved from minority government into personal rule, but Versailles remained the central setting of court politics and royal representation. Ministers, royal councils, clerics, magistrates, military officers, financiers, and provincial administrators continued to shape policy alongside the king. Court favorites could influence access and patronage, but government cannot be reduced to scandal, rumor, or intimate gossip. Versailles remained both a political workplace and a symbolic theater in which proximity to the monarch mattered, but decisions still depended on institutions far beyond the palace. Foreign war again exposed the system's strengths and weaknesses. During the War of the Austrian Succession from 1740 to 1748, France intervened in a European struggle over the Habsburg succession, territorial interests, and the balance among major powers. The settlement brought limited lasting advantages relative to the cost of mobilization. Less than a decade later, the 7 Years' War created an even more serious crisis. France fought Britain in a global imperial contest while also confronting Prussia and participating in the shifting alliance system of continental Europe. The war extended across Europe, North America, the Caribbean, West Africa, India, and the world's oceans. France possessed considerable military and economic resources, but British naval strength, logistical advantages, battlefield outcomes, and the wider alliance structure placed the monarchy under intense pressure. The financial burden deepened, and defeat overseas had long-term strategic consequences. Under the peace settlement of 1763, France ceded Canada and much of its mainland North American position to Britain while retaining some Caribbean possessions and commercial interests. Much of New France passed into British control, marking a major reversal in France's imperial competition with Britain. The loss damaged prestige and intensified debate over military administration, taxation, and the competence of royal government. At home, political conflict with the parliaments grew increasingly serious. These sovereign courts, especially the Parlement of Paris, presented themselves at times as defenders of fundamental law and traditional liberty against ministerial overreach. Yet their resistance also reflected institutional privilege, venal office, corporate interest, and disputes over jurisdiction. Their remonstrances could express genuine concerns about legality while also protecting the position of magistrates and privileged bodies. The conflict became especially sharp when the Crown attempted fiscal or judicial reforms that threatened established interests. In 1771, Chancellor René Nicolas Charles Augustin de Maupeou carried out a dramatic restructuring of the judicial system, suppressing the old parliaments and replacing them with reorganized courts whose offices were not based on the same venal structure. Supporters presented the reforms as necessary to prevent obstruction and modernize justice. Opponents described them as an attack on established law and political liberty. The dispute became another example of the monarchy's central dilemma: stronger government required reform, but reform itself could weaken legitimacy when important institutions portrayed royal action as arbitrary. Louis XV died in May 1774, leaving the crown to his 19-year-old grandson, Louis XVI. The new king did not inherit an empty treasury in a ruined country, nor did he inherit a monarchy already doomed to collapse. France remained one of the wealthiest and most populous states in Europe, possessed substantial agricultural and commercial resources, maintained great cultural prestige, and still commanded an extensive administrative and military apparatus. Yet the strengths of the monarchy were entangled with structural weaknesses that had become increasingly difficult to ignore. Debt-limited flexibility. Privilege complicated taxation. Provincial and legal diversity restricted uniform. Reform. Dependence on creditors made confidence politically important. Conflict with the parliaments had damaged the image of royal authority. Overseas defeat had encouraged criticism of state competence. Print culture, salons, pamphlets, philosophical debate, and increasingly assertive forms of public opinion were expanding the political audience beyond court and council. Louis XVI therefore inherited more than a crown. He inherited a question his predecessors had never fully resolved: Could a monarchy built on privilege, negotiated authority, dynastic prestige, and unequal fiscal structures reform itself deeply enough to survive an age in which more and more people were demanding that legitimate government explain, justify, and share its power? When Louis XVI inherited the French throne in May 1774 at the age of 19, he became sovereign of a kingdom that remained wealthy, populous, militarily formidable, and culturally influential, yet increasingly difficult to govern through the financial and political arrangements inherited from earlier reigns. His marriage to Marie Antoinette, daughter of Empress Maria Theresa of Austria, had been celebrated in 1770 as part of the diplomatic alignment between France and Austria, and she now became queen beside a young monarch whose reign began with expectations of renewal. One of Louis XVI's earliest major political decisions was to restore the parliaments that had been reorganized under Maupeou. The restoration was popular among many critics of the previous government, but it also returned powerful judicial corporations to positions from which they could challenge future royal reforms. This contradiction would become increasingly important. The king wanted improvement without destroying the institutional foundations of monarchy, yet many of those institutions possessed privileges and interests that made comprehensive reform extremely difficult. And Robert Jacques Turgot, appointed Controller General of Finances in 1774, attempted to reduce expenditures, liberalize the grain trade, remove certain economic restrictions, and challenge forms of privilege that obstructed fiscal and economic reform. His proposals encountered resistance from several directions, including privileged corporations, court interests, magistrates, administrators, and groups concerned about the social consequences of economic change. Turgot was dismissed in 1776, but his fall cannot be explained by a single hostile faction or by an unwilling king simply choosing luxury over reform. It revealed a deeper problem. Changes that appeared rational from the perspective of central administration could threaten legal rights, established incomes, political influence, or local arrangements that powerful groups considered legitimate. Jacques Necker, who later became Director General of Finances, pursued different methods, including borrowing, administrative economies, and efforts to improve confidence in royal credit. The fundamental problem, however, extended beyond the personality or competence of any minister. France governed a large and institutionally complex territory, maintained expensive armed forces, serviced substantial accumulated debt, and relied upon a tax system marked by exemptions, regional differences, indirect taxation, tax farming, and unequal burdens. Some privileged groups contributed through particular taxes and obligations, but the distribution of fiscal responsibility remained difficult to reform comprehensively. The crown could raise enormous sums, yet it could not easily redesign the system that raised them without confronting courts, officeholders, provincial bodies, financiers, and social privileges embedded in law and custom. Foreign policy soon increased the pressure. France viewed the rebellion of Britain's North American colonies through the strategic lens of its long rivalry with Britain, whose victory in the 7 Years' War had greatly weakened French influence overseas. After providing covert assistance, France entered the American War of Independence openly in 1778 following the alliance with the United States. French forces, fleets, financial support, and diplomacy contributed materially to the eventual defeat of Britain's attempt to suppress American independence, and French participation helped restore international prestige damaged in the previous war. But strategic success carried significant financial costs. Much of the effort was financed through borrowing rather than immediate comprehensive tax increases, increasing future debt service obligations. It would be misleading to say that the American War alone bankrupted France or directly caused the Revolution. The fiscal crisis developed from accumulated debt, the costs of successive wars, administrative practices, structural tax inequality, limits on reform, and declining confidence in the Crown's ability to produce a durable settlement. The American conflict intensified those pressures while also providing French officers, readers, and political observers with another important reference point in debates about representation and political rights, though no single ideological transmission explains what followed. Necker attempted to reinforce confidence through public presentation of royal finances. His Compte rendu au roi, published in 1781, offered an unprecedented public representation of ordinary royal revenues and expenditures and helped make financial administration part of wider political discussion. The document increased Necker's popularity, but historians have emphasized that its accounting categories did not provide a complete picture of the monarchy's wartime financial position. Its significance lay partly in the growing expectation that government finances could be explained to an audience beyond the royal council. Necker left office in 1781, and ministerial turnover continued as successive governments searched for ways to stabilize the fiscal system. By the time Charles Alexander de Calonne became Controller General in 1783, borrowing had become increasingly difficult to sustain without convincing creditors that structural reform was possible. Calonne eventually proposed a broad program that included a new land tax intended to reach privileged property more consistently, changes in provincial administration, and other measures designed to strengthen revenue and economic activity. Recognizing the political difficulty of imposing such measures through ordinary channels, the Crown summoned an assembly of notables in 1787. The notables were selected rather than popularly elected, and many belonged to the highest ranks of the clergy, nobility, magistracy, and administration. Calonne expected their approval to strengthen the legitimacy of reform. Instead, substantial skepticism emerged over financial information, administrative proposals, and the authority by which new taxation should be imposed. The Assembly did not produce the settlement the Crown needed. Calonne was dismissed, and the government entered an increasingly dangerous cycle in which fiscal reform and constitutional legitimacy became inseparable. The question was no longer merely how much money the monarchy required. It was who possessed the legitimate authority to consent to new taxes. The parliaments argued that fundamental fiscal changes required approval from the Estates General, a representative institution that had not met since 1614. Their resistance could invoke principles of law and opposition to arbitrary government, but it also defended institutional and social privileges. The Crown attempted to force registration of measures, exiled magistrates, negotiated, retreated, and eventually recalled opponents as political pressure intensified. Each reversal weakened confidence that the existing machinery of royal government could resolve the crisis. Meanwhile, the political audience itself was changing. Enlightenment authors had long debated law, sovereignty, religious toleration, political economy, and the organization of government. Salons, academies, books, newspapers, clandestine literature, and expanding commercial print networks circulated arguments across educated society despite censorship. Philosophers did not mechanically cause revolution, and readers did not share a single ideology, but political language increasingly provided ways to question privilege and evaluate government according to standards beyond inherited authority. As the fiscal struggle became public, pamphlets multiplied and disputes that had once remained within councils and courts became subjects of broader argument. Economic hardship intensified the tension. Poor harvest conditions in the late 1780s contributed to grain shortages and rising bread prices in many areas, putting severe pressure on households for whom bread consumed a substantial portion of ordinary income. These immediate subsistence difficulties were not identical to the long-term fiscal and constitutional crisis, but they unfolded at the same moment, making political conflict more urgent and increasing public sensitivity to questions of taxation, privilege, prices, and government competence. By 1788, royal finances had reached a point where ordinary borrowing and ministerial improvisation could no longer provide a convincing path forward. Louis XVI agreed to summon the Estates General for 1789. The decision was an admission that established methods had failed to secure the necessary fiscal settlement, but it was also an attempt to obtain legitimate consent for reform through a representative body rooted in the monarchy's own institutional tradition. What the Crown could not control was what representation would come to mean once the process began. Elections were organized across the kingdom. Clergy, nobility, and the Third Estate prepared cahiers de doléances recording grievances, requests, expectations, and proposals that varied greatly from one locality to another. Many called for reform rather than the destruction of monarchy, but the act of writing grievances transformed subjects into participants in a national political conversation. Pamphlets argued over voting procedures, the number of representatives assigned to the Third Estate, privilege, citizenship, and the political identity of the nation. In early 1789, a crisis that had begun in ledgers, loans, deficits, and ministerial councils was escaping the boundaries of royal finance. France was beginning to debate not merely how the monarchy should raise money, but who represented the nation, whose consent made taxation legitimate, whether privilege could coexist with political equality, and where sovereignty ultimately resided. The government had summoned an institution to rescue royal authority. Instead, it had opened a political arena in which the foundations of that authority would soon be examined before the entire kingdom. On May 5, 1789, the Estates General opened at Versailles beneath the formal rituals of monarchy, but the central question before France was no longer simply how to repair royal finances. It was who had the right to speak for the nation. Representatives of the clergy, nobility, and Third Estate arrived carrying thousands of cahiers de doléances that recorded grievances and proposals from across the kingdom, yet none of the three orders was politically uniform. Some nobles favored significant reform, many parish priests shared concerns with commoners, and members of the Third Estate differed over how far political change should go. The immediate procedural dispute nevertheless became decisive. Traditionally, each estate could deliberate separately and cast one collective vote, a system that allowed the clergy and nobility together to outweigh the Third Estate despite representing a much smaller share of the population. Deputies of the Third Estate increasingly demanded verification of credentials in common and voting by head, which would allow individual deputies rather than orders to determine outcomes. The dispute stalled the assembly for weeks. On June 17, after repeated attempts to break the deadlock, the Third Estate declared itself the National Assembly, claiming authority not as one corporate order among three but as the representative body of the nation. This was a constitutional transformation in language before it became one in law. The deputies were no longer asking only how the Estates General should vote. They were asserting that political legitimacy derived from the nation and that representation could stand above inherited distinctions of order. 3 days later, on June 20, after finding their usual meeting place unavailable, deputies gathered in an indoor tennis court at Versailles and took the tennis court oath, pledging not to separate until France had been given a constitution. The oath did not declare a republic, nor did it call for the immediate destruction of monarchy. Many participants still imagined a reformed kingdom in which the king would retain an important executive role under constitutional limits. But the balance of authority was shifting. In the following days, many members of the clergy and some nobles joined the National Assembly, while divisions within each estate became increasingly visible. Louis XVI eventually instructed the remaining deputies of the privileged orders to participate, but this concession did not restore the political situation that had existed in May. A representative body had claimed national sovereignty, and the monarchy now had to negotiate with an institution whose legitimacy no longer depended solely on royal summons. Events in Paris accelerated the crisis. Troop concentrations around the capital, uncertainty over royal intentions, food anxiety, rising prices, political rumor, and the dismissal of Jacques Necker on July 11 contributed to fears that the reform movement might be forcibly suppressed. It is impossible to assign one exact motive to every person who took to the streets, because participants acted from different combinations of political fear, economic distress, neighborhood solidarity, rumor, and concern over weapons and security. On July 14, crowds moved against the Bastille, an old fortress and prison that had become a powerful symbol of royal coercion even though relatively few prisoners were held there at the time. The fortress fell that day, and the political effect was immediate. The event demonstrated that the crown could no longer assume control of Paris through traditional authority alone. Louis XVI recalled Necker, recognized the new municipal authorities in the capital, and accepted the tricolor cockade during a visit to Paris. Across France, however, the crisis extended far beyond the capital. Municipal governments changed hands, local militias formed, royal officials sometimes lost effective control, and communities interpreted uncertain reports through the lens of local tensions. During the period known as the Great Fear, rumors of brigands, aristocratic plots, grain seizures, and impending attacks spread across many rural areas. The pattern differed from region to region, and the surviving evidence does not justify treating every disturbance as part of a single coordinated movement. Yet the political consequences were profound. Peasant actions against seigneurial records and dues, combined with fear of rural disorder, pushed the National Assembly toward a dramatic response. During the night of August 4 and into the following days, deputies renounced or attacked a wide range of feudal, seigneurial, clerical, provincial, and corporate privileges. The exact implementation of these measures was complicated, and some dues were initially subject to redemption rather than immediate abolition, but the political meaning was unmistakable. The legal order of privilege that had structured much of the old regime was being dismantled in principle. Later that month, the Assembly adopted the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. It proclaimed principles of liberty, legal equality, national sovereignty, security, property, and the idea that law should express the general will. The declaration did not resolve the practical questions of who would exercise political rights, how executive authority would function, or how equality would apply across gender, property, colony, and status. Yet it changed the language of legitimacy. Sovereignty was increasingly located in the nation rather than embodied exclusively in the king. Louis XVI remained monarch, but the foundations of kingship were being redefined around constitutional authorization rather than unquestioned inherited authority. This transformation unfolded amid worsening uncertainty over food and politics. By early October, bread shortages and high prices remained serious concerns in Paris, while political tensions focused on the king's acceptance of revolutionary decrees and on reports surrounding a banquet held by royal guards at Versailles. Later accounts and political journalism often magnified rumor into certainty, so the evidence must be handled cautiously. What is clear is that on October 5, large crowds, including many market women and other Parisians, marched from Paris to Versailles. Their motives were not uniform. Bread and subsistence concerns mattered, but so did political pressure, suspicion of the court, demands regarding royal acceptance of assembly measures, and the growing belief that the king should be closer to the revolutionary capital. Members of the National Guard under the Marquis de Lafayette also moved toward Versailles. On October 6, the royal family left the palace and traveled to Paris, eventually taking residence at the Tuileries. The symbolic consequences were enormous. Versailles had been the grand stage from which Bourbon monarchy had projected hierarchy, ritual, and controlled access. Now the king, queen, and their children lived in the capital under constant public attention and within the political orbit of the National Assembly. The monarchy had not yet been abolished, but it had been physically displaced from the setting that had represented royal supremacy for generations. Marie Antoinette became increasingly important within this altered political landscape, not only because she was queen but because her public reputation had already been damaged by years of hostile representation. Her Austrian birth made her vulnerable to xenophobic suspicion, while court scandal, political opposition, and misogynistic pamphlet culture constructed an image of extravagance, manipulation, and moral corruption around her. Some allegations circulated so widely that they became part of revolutionary political mythology, but repetition does not make them established fact. The notorious diamond necklace affair, for example, harmed her reputation even though she was not responsible for the fraud. Political hostility increasingly transformed the queen into a symbol onto which critics projected broader anxieties about court influence, foreign alliances, luxury, and monarchical secrecy. Meanwhile, the National Assembly moved beyond declarations into institutional reconstruction. France was reorganized into departments, replacing many older provincial divisions with a more standardized territorial structure. Corporate privileges were dismantled, legal and administrative authority was reconfigured, and the state confronted its continuing financial emergency by turning to church property. In late 1789, ecclesiastical lands were placed at the disposal of the nation, helping support the new paper instruments known as assignats and linking fiscal reform to a revolutionary transformation of property. In 1790, the civil constitution of the clergy reorganized the Catholic Church in France, redrawing dioceses, providing for the election of bishops and priests under the new political order, and integrating clerical administration more directly into the revolutionary state. The requirement that clergy swear an oath to the Constitution produced deep divisions between those who accepted the settlement and those who refused. Religious disagreement therefore became political mistrust. At the same time, noble emigration increased, opponents of the revolution gathered outside France, and disputes intensified over the king's constitutional veto, ministerial responsibility, and the proper limits of executive authority. None of these conflicts had a predetermined outcome. Many revolutionaries still hoped that monarchy and national sovereignty could be reconciled through a written constitution. Louis XVI was still king, and the constitutional process still assumed a place for the crown. Yet the political environment had changed fundamentally. The royal family no longer inhabited Versailles as the distant center of a ceremonial monarchy. It lived at the Tuileries, surrounded by Paris, watched by an increasingly mobilized political public, and dependent on negotiations with representatives who claimed authority in the name of the nation. The central question was therefore no longer whether the monarchy would accept reform in the abstract. It was whether a constitutional order could function when suspicion had become attached to nearly every act of the crown, and whether the revolution could entrust executive power to a king whose survival now depended on convincing the nation that he could be part of the new political system rather than an obstacle to it. The constitutional monarchy created in 1791 rested on a fragile assumption, that Louis XVI and the revolution could still share a political future. Within months, that assumption was tested by an event that transformed suspicion of the crown into a crisis of confidence. During the night of June 20 and 21, 1791, Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette, their children, and accompanying members of the royal household left Paris in an attempted journey toward the eastern frontier. The decision emerged from several overlapping pressures, including the royal family's restricted position in Paris, Louis XVI's objections to important revolutionary policies, religious concerns surrounding the civil constitution of the clergy, fears about political disorder, and expectations that greater freedom of movement might strengthen the monarchy's negotiating position. The surviving evidence does not justify reducing the attempt to one private motive or reconstructing exact conversations that were never reliably recorded. What mattered politically was what happened next. The royal party was recognized during the journey, stopped at Versailles, and returned to Paris under guard. The king who had publicly remained within the revolutionary constitutional process had now attempted to leave the capital, and opponents could point to the episode as evidence that his commitment to that process could not simply be assumed. Republican arguments gained greater visibility, while constitutional monarchists faced the difficult task of preserving a system that still required a king. The National Constituent Assembly chose to continue that project. The constitution adopted on September 3, 1791 established national sovereignty and representative government while retaining Louis XVI as constitutional monarch, with defined executive authority and a suspensive veto. Quoique Hoi Fap plus one Varennes therefore did not immediately destroy monarchy, but it altered the political meaning of almost every subsequent royal action. Before the constitution was completed, the crisis reached the Champ de Mars in Paris. In July 1791, Republican and anti-monarchical activists gathered around a petition seeking political action against the king. Municipal authorities attempted to restore order, and the confrontation ended with National Guard gunfire against the gathering. The episode deepened divisions between constitutional moderates and more radical revolutionary movements, creating a political fracture that would matter greatly during the following year. Quoique Hoi Fap when the National Constituent Assembly completed its work, it was replaced by the Legislative Assembly in October 1791. The new legislature inherited a constitutional system already weakened by distrust. Outside France, émigrés, including nobles and royal relatives who had left the country, organized politically and pressed foreign rulers to oppose the revolution. Within France, rumors and documented diplomatic concerns surrounding foreign intervention mixed with fears of counter-revolution. Austria had particular importance because Marie Antoinette was the sister of Emperor Leopold II, but European policy was shaped by strategic calculations that went beyond family relationships. Revolutionary factions themselves were divided over war. Some deputies believed conflict could expose enemies of the revolution, defend the new political order, or extend revolutionary principles. Others warned that war could strengthen executive power, empower generals, or place the revolution in greater danger. Louis XVI and figures around the crown also had their own calculations regarding international conflict, but their motives were not identical, and historians have debated how different expectations interacted. On April 20, 1792, France declared war on the King of Hungary and Bohemia, effectively opening war against the Austrian monarchy. Prussia soon entered the conflict on Austria's side. Early French military operations exposed serious weaknesses in command, organization, discipline, and coordination. Setbacks at the front intensified suspicions at home. Political opponents increasingly interpreted military failure through the language of betrayal, while the king's constitutional vetoes became evidence, for his critics, that the executive was obstructing measures intended to defend the revolution. Louis XVI used his veto against decrees concerning émigrés and refractory clergy, exercising a power that the constitution itself had granted him, yet political legality did not prevent political consequences. To supporters of the king, the veto remained a constitutional safeguard. To increasingly distrustful opponents, it appeared to confirm that the crown and the national legislature were moving in opposite directions. Paris became the center of escalating mobilization. Political clubs, sectional assemblies, newspapers, petitions, National Guard formations, and activists created an environment in which policy disputes could rapidly become questions of national survival. The distinction between documented evidence and political propaganda became increasingly important. Revolutionary newspapers accused the court of conspiracy, while royalist and émigré publications depicted the revolution as illegitimate disorder. Neither body of polemic can be treated as a transparent record of private plans or public opinion. Yet their influence was real because political actors made decisions in an atmosphere saturated with suspicion. In the summer of 1792, the international crisis intensified further. An allied army under the Duke of Brunswick prepared to advance into France, and the Brunswick Manifesto threatened severe consequences if the French royal family were harmed. Intended to intimidate opposition and protect the monarchy, the declaration instead strengthened fears among many revolutionaries that foreign invasion and restoration of unrestricted royal authority were connected. Wikipedia +1 It did not alone cause the overthrow that followed. The crisis had already been built from Varennes, constitutional conflict, war, military setbacks, royal vetoes, factional rivalry, economic anxiety, émigré activity, and growing political mobilization. But the manifesto entered that combustible environment at a moment when confidence in the crown was already close to breaking. On August 10, 1792, insurgent forces drawn from Paris sections, National Guards, and revolutionary militants moved against the Tuileries palace. Louis XVI and the royal family left the palace and sought protection with the Legislative Assembly. Fighting took place around the royal residence, but the decisive consequence for this story was institutional rather than military. The Legislative Assembly suspended Louis XVI from his functions and called for the election of a new national convention. The constitutional monarchy established less than a year earlier had effectively ceased to operate. The royal family was subsequently confined in the Temple, while elections proceeded for the body that would determine the next form of government. The French National Assembly's historical record identifies August 10 as the suspension of Louis XVI followed by the election of the convention. Quoi qu'il fasse, Louis XVI now became the central image of a monarchy whose transformation had outrun its capacity for compromise. Contemporary portraits had often represented him in the visual language of Bourbon sovereignty, surrounded by royal insignia, formal dress, and symbols of hereditary legitimacy. His documented public appearances after 1789 presented a very different political reality, a king operating within assemblies, constitutional ceremonies, revolutionary crowds, and increasingly restrictive circumstances. Neither image should turn him into a caricature. He was not an all-powerful tyrant directing events without limits, but neither was he a politically irrelevant innocent detached from consequential decisions. He accepted some reforms, opposed others, employed constitutional powers, attempted to leave Paris, conducted diplomacy, changed ministers, and participated in choices whose consequences interacted with forces far beyond his personal control. The new National Convention assembled in September. On September 21, 1792, it abolished monarchy in France. The Republic was subsequently dated from September 22, the first day of what became year one of the French Republic. The decision ended the institutional kingship of the ancien regime Bourbon monarchy, but it did not erase the Bourbon family, eliminate monarchist politics, or determine the permanent future of monarchy in France. What it did was remove the constitutional shield that had still separated the king from the status of an accused political actor. Louis XVI was no longer sovereign. Revolutionary proceedings increasingly referred to him as Louis Capet, a name intended to strip away the political significance of royal title and place the former monarch within a new language of citizenship and accountability. Soon the convention would confront a question with no easy constitutional precedent: if sovereignty now belonged to the nation, what was the legal status of the man who had once embodied sovereignty himself? Louis Capet would be brought before the representatives of the Republic, and his trial would force them to decide whether a deposed king could truly be judged as an ordinary citizen, whether he remained a uniquely dangerous political enemy, or whether the very institution he had represented made such a distinction impossible. By December 1792, Louis XVI no longer stood before France as a constitutional monarch whose powers might still be renegotiated. He stood before the National Convention as an accused former king, and the political problem was no longer whether monarchy could be limited but whether the man who had embodied it could be judged under the sovereignty that had replaced him. The case against Louis drew on years of revolutionary suspicion, diplomatic controversy, royal vetoes, the flight to Varennes, and allegations that the crown had encouraged resistance to the revolution. The discovery of documents from a concealed iron chest at the Tuileries in November 1792 intensified the crisis. Papers linked to contacts between the court and political figures were examined and publicized, and revolutionary leaders used them to reinforce arguments that the former king had maintained secret political relationships while publicly operating within the constitutional order. The documents did not make every accusation automatically true, nor did they prove that all political outcomes had been directed by a single royal conspiracy, but they became powerful evidence in a political environment already shaped by profound distrust. The convention formally opened proceedings against Louis in December. He was confronted with a long series of charges concerning his conduct before and during the revolution, including accusations related to resistance to revolutionary measures, the attempted flight from Paris, relations with émigrés and foreign powers, and actions interpreted as hostile to national sovereignty. Louis answered questions before the convention and was assisted by legal counsel, including Raymond de Sise, François Denis Tronchet, and Guillaume Crétin de Lamoignon de Malherbe. The proceedings combined legal argument with an unavoidable political reality. The judges were also representatives of a republic created by the abolition of the institution Louis had once headed. Deputies did not approach the case with identical motives. Some regarded punishment as necessary for the security and legitimacy of the republic. Others worried about legality, political precedent, civil conflict, or the consequences of imposing the ultimate penalty. Debate therefore centered not only on guilt but also on whether the convention itself should decide the case, whether the judgment should be submitted to a popular appeal, and what punishment should follow. In January 1793, the deputies voted on these questions individually. Louis was found guilty of conspiracy against public liberty and attacks upon national security. A proposal to submit the judgment to the people was rejected. The vote on punishment was closely contested, but a majority supported death without the kind of delay that might have transformed the sentence into a continuing political bargaining point. On January 21, 1793, Louis XVI was executed in Paris. The event should not be reduced to spectacle. Its deeper significance lay in what it represented. A man who had been crowned within a political tradition of hereditary and sacred kingship had been condemned by representatives claiming authority from the nation. For many contemporaries across Europe, the execution transformed the French Revolution from a constitutional and dynastic crisis into an unmistakable challenge to the political assumptions of hereditary monarchy. Monarchist observers could see the death as evidence of revolutionary extremism and regicide. Revolutionaries could interpret it as proof that no individual stood above national sovereignty. Foreign governments had strategic reasons for opposing revolutionary France that went beyond the fate of one ruler, but the execution intensified the symbolic conflict between the Republic and monarchical Europe. It did not end the wars already underway, nor did it settle France internally. Instead, international conflict widened while political, regional, religious, and social divisions within France became increasingly severe. The former queen now faced a political transformation of her own status. Marie Antoinette had been imprisoned with the royal family after August 1792 and remained confined after her husband's death. In August 1793, she was transferred from the Temple to the Conciergerie, placing her more directly within the machinery of revolutionary justice. Her public reputation had long been shaped by hostile pamphlets, court rumors, xenophobia directed at her Austrian birth, political accusations, and deeply misogynistic attacks. Some of the most sensational claims repeated during revolutionary polemics were unsupported or distorted, and they cannot responsibly be treated as established descriptions of her conduct. Her trial before the Revolutionary Tribunal in October 1793 focused on allegations of treason, political conspiracy, communication with foreign powers, and participation in actions against the revolution, alongside other accusations that reflected the toxic political culture surrounding her image. The proceedings unfolded in a republic under intense wartime and internal pressure, where revolutionary justice had become increasingly severe. Marie Antoinette was convicted and executed on October 16, 1793. Her death completed the political destruction of the royal couple that had occupied the Tuileries little more than a year earlier, but it did not explain by itself why the monarchy had fallen. That requires returning to the larger claims that have framed this entire story and testing them against the evidence. The language of tyranny captures something real about Bourbon government, but only if the word is used with precision. Successive Bourbon kings developed powerful claims of sovereignty and expanded institutions through which royal authority could be exercised. The monarchy censored publications, extracted taxes through unequal systems, punished political resistance, regulated religious life, and at crucial moments used coercive policies against communities whose practices or autonomy conflicted with royal objectives. The revocation of the Edict of Nantes under Louis XIV remains one of the clearest examples of religious repression backed by state power. Royal government also asserted increasingly ambitious claims about the king's authority in legislation, administration, justice, diplomacy, and war. Yet none of this means that Bourbon France was governed by an unrestricted individual will. Kings depended on ministers, councils, courts, parliaments, officeholders, financiers, provincial estates, municipal authorities, church institutions, noble networks, local elites, customary law, privilege, and credit. Taxes had to be assessed and collected through inherited systems. Edicts had to be registered, interpreted, administered, negotiated, and enforced. Provincial cooperation mattered. Creditors had to believe the crown could repay them. Even the strongest monarch could not transform that institutional landscape into a modern uniform bureaucracy by command alone. Absolutism described a powerful claim about sovereignty, but the practical monarchy remained dependent upon structures it could not simply abolish without creating resistance. Versailles must be understood with the same care. Louis XIV transformed the palace into the most spectacular political stage of Bourbon monarchy. Court ritual regulated access. Patronage connected noble ambition to royal favor. Architecture, gardens, painting, ceremony, diplomacy, and public display presented kingship as the organizing center of hierarchy. Ministers worked there, ambassadors observed it, petitioners pursued access there, and aristocrats competed for proximity within a system in which ceremonial distinction could carry political value. Versailles was therefore both a functioning court environment and a political symbol of extraordinary power. But the palace did not single-handedly bankrupt France. Its construction and maintenance required substantial resources, yet the fiscal collapse of the 1780s developed through far larger structural pressures, accumulated war debts, expensive military commitments, debt service, unequal taxation, privileged exemptions, fragmented administration, dependence on borrowing, and repeated failure to establish reforms that creditors and political institutions would accept as durable. Reducing the financial crisis to palace luxury turns a complex fiscal and constitutional breakdown into a moral fable. The violent imagery attached to the monarchy's fall also requires distinction between chronology and symbolism. Royal authority collapsed amid intense political mobilization, street conflict, foreign war, imprisonment, revolutionary justice, and executions. But bloodshed was not the single cause of abolition. The National Convention abolished the monarchy on September 21, 1792, 4 months before Louis XVI was executed. The institutional destruction of kingship therefore preceded the death of the king. Fiscal crisis, the struggle over representation, the National Assembly's claim to sovereignty, Varennes, constitutional mistrust, war, royal vetoes, radicalization, foreign threats, and the uprising of August 10 all contributed to the collapse. Violence became part of that process and intensified afterward, but the monarchy did not fall simply because violence overwhelmed an otherwise stable system. Nor did September 1792 permanently remove monarchy from French history. After the Revolutionary and Napoleonic eras, Louis XVIII, brother of Louis XVI, returned with the Bourbon Restoration in 1814. Napoleon's return temporarily displaced him in 1815, but Louis XVIII was restored again after Napoleon's final defeat. The Bourbon monarchy then continued under Louis XVIII and, after his death in 1824, under Charles X. Only the July Revolution of 1830 removed the senior Bourbon line from the French throne. Even then, monarchy itself survived under the Orleans branch in the July monarchy. The events of 1792 therefore destroyed the ancien regime form of Bourbon kingship, not the possibility of monarchy in France forever. That distinction changes the meaning of the entire dynastic arc. Henry IV had entered a kingdom fractured by religion and rebuilt royal legitimacy through dynastic right, conversion, negotiation, military success, and settlement. Louis XIII and Richelieu had expanded royal capacity while confronting aristocratic, Protestant, provincial, and foreign resistance. Louis XIV had elevated sovereignty, court ritual, administrative coordination, and dynastic prestige to extraordinary heights. Louis XV inherited the burdens created by war, debt, institutional privilege, and political conflict. Louis XVI inherited those burdens in an age when public debate increasingly demanded that government justify taxation, representation, law, and authority in new terms. What collapsed was not simply a family's possession of a palace. It was a political system whose inherited methods of negotiation and command could no longer resolve the struggle over who legitimately represented the nation. Versailles remained standing after the Revolution, but its political meaning had changed completely. The palace that had once organized access to royal power no longer functioned as the unquestioned center of French political life. The portraits, ceremonies, crowns, documents, court records, edicts, and administrative papers that had once affirmed Bourbon sovereignty were now being reinterpreted within a different political language. Some became evidence against the monarchy. Others became records through which later generations tried to understand how the old system had actually worked. The central question had shifted from how subjects should obey a sovereign to how citizens, representatives, constitutions, and institutions should define legitimate authority. In that transformation, the symbols of Bourbon power survived, but the political assumptions that had once made those symbols appear permanent had been broken. After 1793, the French Revolution entered an even more dangerous phase, but those later events must be understood as part of a rapidly changing revolutionary context rather than as a simple continuation of Bourbon government by other means. France remained at war with foreign powers, internal resistance intensified in several regions, competing revolutionary factions struggled over authority, and the government adopted increasingly severe measures during the period later known as the Reign of Terror. Revolutionary violence, emergency legislation, political trials, civil conflict, and wartime mobilization reshaped the country, but they cannot be explained as the automatic consequence of centuries of monarchy, nor can every act of repression be traced directly back to Bourbon policy. By this point, sovereignty had been redefined, institutions had been dismantled or rebuilt, and political actors were making decisions within a new republican framework shaped by war, fear, ideology, factional rivalry, and attempts to defend or transform the revolution. That distinction matters because the end of the old monarchy was not the end of history. It was the beginning of a new struggle over what political legitimacy in France should mean. Looking back across the Bourbon dynasty reveals a pattern more complicated than either triumph or decline. Henry IV inherited a crown weakened by religious civil war and contested legitimacy, then stabilized the monarchy through dynastic right, military success, conversion, negotiation, and the limited settlement embodied in the Edict of Nantes. Louis XIII and Richelieu strengthened royal administrative and military capacity, reduced certain forms of political autonomy, and expanded the reach of the crown, but they still governed through councils, courts, officeholders, provincial elites, church structures, local privileges, and negotiated authority. Louis XIV transformed the image of Bourbon kingship more dramatically than any of his predecessors. Under his personal rule, royal sovereignty, war, ceremony, patronage, court hierarchy, and Versailles became central to the political language of monarchy. His reign demonstrated how power could be staged as well as exercised. Yet even at the height of that spectacle, the state remained dependent on taxation systems it did not fully control, on credit it could not safely ignore, on officials whose offices carried property rights, on regional institutions that retained legal weight, and on elites whose cooperation was essential. Louis XV inherited those structures and confronted the consequences of expensive wars, overseas reverses, fiscal strain, financial experimentation, and institutional conflict, especially with the parliaments. Louis XVI then inherited a monarchy that still possessed immense resources and prestige but had increasingly little room for error. His ministers attempted reform, but no durable settlement was achieved before fiscal crisis became a dispute over representation, and that dispute became a constitutional revolution. None of these reigns can be understood through personality alone. Dynastic legitimacy mattered, but so did law. Monarchy mattered, but so did administrative capacity. Absolutist theory mattered, but so did the gap between claims of sovereignty and the practical limits of governing a large, privileged, legally diverse kingdom. The parliaments could resist royal measures in the language of law and liberty while also protecting corporate interests. Taxation could finance war and administration while reinforcing resentment because burdens were distributed unevenly. Privilege could appear to contemporaries as a legitimate legal status and, at the same time, become increasingly difficult to defend as political debate moved toward equality before the law. Religion could serve as a foundation of social and political order while coercive policies toward Protestants and later conflicts over the civil constitution of the clergy transformed confessional questions into struggles over state authority and conscience. Versailles embodied these contradictions more visibly than any other place. It was a palace, a court, a working political environment, a network of patronage, a theater of hierarchy, and a symbol of royal magnificence. It concentrated access and ritual around the person of the monarch, but it never replaced the institutional complexity of France. Patronage linked aristocratic ambition to the crown, yet nobles remained powerful through land, offices, military command, provincial influence, and family networks. War enhanced Bourbon prestige and sometimes expanded French influence, yet repeated military commitments increased taxation, borrowing, debt service, and dependence on financiers. Colonial competition brought trade, naval expansion, and strategic ambition, while also tying France to imperial systems whose costs and rivalries extended far beyond Versailles. Public opinion, too, became increasingly important, but it cannot be treated as if 18th-century France suddenly spoke with one voice. Enlightenment debate, salons, academies, pamphlets, newspapers, clandestine publications, sermons, provincial correspondence, and political rumor created overlapping audiences rather than a single national mind. Philosophers did not mechanically cause revolution, just as bread prices did not mechanically produce constitutional crisis. Subsistence stress in the late 1780s intensified anger and fear, while debt and fiscal inequality weakened confidence in government. Representation then turned those pressures into a question of sovereignty: who had the right to authorize taxation, make law, and speak for the nation. Once that question could no longer be contained within the traditional institutions of monarchy, political conflict moved into a different register. Propaganda accelerated that transformation, but propaganda must be separated from evidence. Royalist publications exaggerated revolutionary disorder. Revolutionary pamphlets often exaggerated court conspiracy, aristocratic corruption, and the private conduct of the royal family. Marie Antoinette was subjected to especially aggressive political attacks shaped by xenophobia, hostility toward court influence, and gendered assumptions about female power. Those texts are historically important because they reveal how political enemies constructed public images, not because their allegations can be repeated as unquestioned fact. The same principle applies to every major source used to reconstruct this period. Royal edicts and ordinances reveal what the crown attempted to command, but not necessarily how fully those commands were carried out. Records of royal councils show the workings of central government, but they represent decisions produced within specific administrative settings. Parliamentary remonstrances reveal legal and political opposition, but they also reflect the institutional interests of magistrates. Financial accounts can expose revenues, expenditures, debt, and borrowing, yet accounting categories themselves must be interpreted carefully. Ministerial correspondence may reveal priorities, uncertainty, and negotiation, but private letters are not automatically more truthful than public documents. Diplomatic dispatches provide valuable observations, although foreign ambassadors interpreted France through the strategic interests and assumptions of their own courts. Memoirs can preserve detail unavailable elsewhere, but they were often written later and shaped by memory, reputation, self-defense, or retrospective judgment. Newspapers and pamphlets show what arguments circulated, not what every reader believed. Revolutionary decrees document institutional change, while trial records reveal both legal procedure and political context. Portraits, architecture, furniture, medals, ceremonies, gardens, and other forms of material culture provide evidence of how authority was represented. No single anecdote should be allowed to become the whole history. Famous sayings attributed to kings, scandalous rumors about queens, dramatic memoir scenes, and later revolutionary legends can be powerful storytelling devices, but only when their evidentiary status is made clear. Bourbon portraiture is particularly revealing in this respect. The great state portraits of Louis XIV and his successors show monarchs surrounded by regalia, textiles, columns, armor, crowns, and ceremonial space. They tell us how monarchy wished to be seen, stable, majestic, continuous, ordered, and above faction. They do not tell us exactly what a ruler privately felt at the moment a painter arranged the composition. Versailles imagery works the same way. The Hall of Mirrors, the gardens, the royal apartments, processions, court dress, and carefully controlled rituals reveal how hierarchy and access were staged. They demonstrate political intention and cultural power, but they cannot be treated as a transparent photograph of how government actually functioned behind the image. This is why the dramatic language surrounding the Bourbon story is both powerful and incomplete. The idea of tyranny identifies genuine tendencies toward concentrated sovereignty, coercive taxation, censorship, religious repression, and the use of royal institutions to discipline political resistance. But it oversimplifies if it suggests that every royal decision was unlimited, arbitrary, or uncontested. Government remained negotiated, legally layered, and institutionally constrained. Versailles identifies a real center and symbol of Bourbon power. But it becomes misleading if palace magnificence is made the primary explanation for the fiscal collapse of the 1780s. Debt service, war expenditure, unequal taxation, privilege, administrative fragmentation, weak reform mechanisms, and declining confidence in royal credit were far more consequential. The violent collapse of monarchy captures the revolutionary atmosphere of war, confrontation, imprisonment, and execution, but it can conceal the long legal, fiscal, social, and political breakdown that preceded September 1792. The monarchy was abolished before Louis XVI was executed, and its fall cannot be reduced to the final acts that made the rupture so visible. Nor did the Bourbon story end permanently with that abolition. Louis XVIII returned in 1814 after the collapse of Napoleon's empire, was displaced during Napoleon's brief return in 1815, and was restored again later that year. The restored monarchy did not simply recreate the political world of Louis XVI. France had been transformed by revolution, administrative reorganization, property changes, legal reform, war, and new expectations about citizenship and representation. When Charles X succeeded Louis XVIII, his reign confronted a society that could no longer be governed as though 1789 had never happened. The July Revolution of 1830 removed the senior Bourbon line from the throne, demonstrating that dynastic restoration had not restored the old political settlement intact. Later events would carry French politics in directions that 18th-century actors could not have known in advance, and those later outcomes should never be placed retroactively into their minds. The historical significance of the House of Bourbon lies precisely in this tension between spectacle and structure. The dynasty created one of Europe's most powerful languages of monarchy, and Versailles became its most enduring visual expression. Yet beneath that magnificence stood a complex state that depended on law, privilege, administration, negotiation, credit, religious authority, military success, provincial cooperation, and the willingness of subjects and institutions to accept the terms of government. Over time, those terms became harder to reconcile. War increased fiscal demands. Credit increased dependence on confidence. Privilege obstructed uniform reform. Public debate widened the political audience. Representation transformed financial dispute into constitutional conflict. Sovereignty moved from an inherited royal claim toward the language of the nation. The collapse that followed was therefore neither a simple punishment for luxury nor an inevitable victory over tyranny. It was the result of accumulated political choices and structural pressures interacting across generations, until a monarchy that had once seemed capable of mastering civil war, aristocratic resistance, religious division, and European rivalry could no longer produce a political settlement accepted as legitimate. That transformation reshaped France, altered the balance of Europe, and left behind a historical memory in which the brilliance of Versailles and the destruction of Bourbon kingship remain inseparable symbols of how power can appear permanent even while the foundations beneath it are changing.